The Cold War era, with its silent battles and unspoken wars, gave birth to some of the most notorious spies in history. Men and women who, under the guise of patriotism, sold their country's secrets for motives as varied as ideology, money, or coercion. How does a nation protect itself when the enemy could be the person in the next cubicle, your neighbor, or even a friend? Today we examine the stories of America's most infamous turncoats, unraveling the intricate web of lies and deceit. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today, the worst spies in recent American history. Soviet spies. If you've seen the hit movie Oppenheimer, or know anything about the famous Manhattan Project to build the world's first nuclear weapon, you know that Soviet spies within the project were feeding secrets to Moscow virtually the whole time the secret mission was working on what should have been the most secret of top secrets. At the time, the Soviets were a military ally, albeit a mistrusted one. After the war of spies between the Soviet Union and the United States and its allies began in earnest. In 1950, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested for passing nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. Their case made headlines for years with accusations of innocence, anti-Semitic prejudice within the U.S. government, and more. There was also convincing evidence that they did indeed spy for the Soviet Union. The Rosenbergs were sentenced to death and were executed in the electric chair in 1953. In the later years of the Cold War, and especially in the 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan took a harder line against the actions of the Soviet Union around the world, Americans spying for the Soviets volunteered their services, giving literal boxloads of information to America's most dangerous enemy and its communist ally in the Caribbean, Cuba. John Walker. Some spies work alone. Others are recruited and have handlers who oversee their activities, sometimes guide them, and often ensure that they are not double agents. Some recruit family members and friends, and that's precisely what John Anthony Walker, a U.S. Navy warrant officer, did. Walker recruited his brother, son, and a close friend, all of whom were either in the Navy or defense contractors with access to critical naval secrets. He also attempted to recruit his daughter, who had a brief U.S. Army career, and though she refused, she did not report Walker's activities to the authorities. However, she did provide testimony against her father in return for immunity from prosecution. Walker was born in 1937 and was given the choice of joining the Navy or serving time in jail for a series of petty robberies, a common sentence at the time. Walker joined the Navy and immediately showed a talent for radio work and cryptography. In a relatively short 8-year span, he went from radio man to chief petty officer and became a warrant officer shortly after. Warrant officers are high-ranked, non-commissioned officers with a dedicated specialty. Unfortunately for Walker, he was also a heavy drinker in love with the nightlife around the submarine base where he was stationed in South Carolina in the mid-1960s. He opened a bar there, which plunged him into debt, that many people believe was the primary factor in approaching the Soviets with top-secret communications and codes from the submarines he worked on. In the spring of 1967, he was stationed at Komsubland, Submarine Command Atlantic, where he was put in charge of the mechanics of the daily communications for the entire Atlantic submarine force and the entire U.S. submarine fleet. Walker was not the commanding officer or ultimate authority over these communications. Still, he saw many of them, and his responsibilities included making sure that communications went through without incident and were coded, delivered, and received correctly. Walker took the fateful step towards treachery by walking into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. in the winter of 1967 and offering them a top-secret cipher, code, card for naval radio communications. In return, he was paid a few $1,000s. What's more, after the Soviets had checked him out, he was put on kind of a retainer, paid from $500 to $1,000 a week. No small amount of money for that time. What Walker likely knew or found out was that as soon as he walked into the embassy, Soviets had him. They could threaten to expose him at any time and ruin his life. But they didn't need to do that with Walker, who gave the Russians information for nearly 20 years. Perhaps it was Walker trying to justify his actions and somehow try to prove he was more intelligent than the Soviets. But when arrested in 1985, he claimed that he knew the first batches of information he initially gave them were useless, for the North Korean allies of the USSR had already captured the same type of card when they seized the USS Pueblo in 1968, except that the Pueblo incident happened after Walker began spying. From 1967 to the early 1980s, Walker gave up massive amounts of information to the Soviet Union. The most damaging information that we know of was how US submarines could easily track and follow Russian nuclear submarines through the world's oceans based on the cavitation or propeller noise of the Soviet subs. After Walker's information was processed, Soviet subs suddenly began to be able to evade detection. They changed the design of their propellers based on Walker's treachery. In 1973-74, Walker was given a new assignment, which meant he no longer had access to the information the Soviets most wanted. So he recruited a friend, Jerry Whitworth, who also had access to top-secret information regarding U.S. submarine operations. Walker initially told Whitworth that the secret data was going to Israel, a country that Whitworth strongly supported. However, not long afterward, Walker's friend discovered the final destination of the top-secret information and money he received. Despite knowing the Soviets were behind it all, Whitworth continued supplying Walker with national secrets. In 1976, Walker became worried that his superior officers were beginning to notice some irregularities and lapses in Walker's duty logs, so he opted to retire. However, he kept running Whitworth and recruited his brother Arthur, a retired Navyman, and then military contractor with access to the same types of secrets that Walker had had. Walker also took his impressionable son under his wing and steered him towards a naval career, which at one point, coincidentally, involved his being responsible for destroying top-secret documents aboard the incredibly important USS Nimitz, the famous nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. During this time, Walker's marriage dissolved into a mess of alcoholism on both sides, and when his ex-wife Barbara was told that Walker had attempted to recruit their daughter, it was the last straw for her. She had had her suspicions, but this sent her over the edge. Barbara Walker approached the FBI, and though they at first dismissed her as a bitter ex-wife with a drinking problem, the details she gave them caused them to put a tail on Walker, who was followed to a dead drop in the woods of Maryland, and arrested when he left a large box of secret documents under a lone road sign in the middle of nowhere on the night of May 20th, 1985. Within days, the FBI and the U.S. Naval Intelligence arrested Whitworth, Walker's older brother, and his son, who was found sleeping over 15 pounds of stolen documents under his bunk in a footlocker aboard ship. John Walker was given a life sentence. He agreed to cooperate with authorities fully if they reduced his son's possible life sentence to 25 years, and gave highly detailed accounts of Whitworth and his older brother's activities. Arthur Walker received 3 life sentences, and Whitworth was given 365 years, essentially the same thing. Whitworth is still in prison at age 84. John Walker and his brother died while incarcerated, and Michael Walker was released after serving 15 years and lives quietly near Cape Cod. The U.S. government and then Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger described the damage done by the Walker spy ring as perhaps the most damaging Soviet spy ring in U.S. history. The Walker ring gave an estimated 1 million documents to the Soviets. Robert Hanssen. Other nations, particularly the Soviet Union, and after 1991 Russia, have been relatively successful in recruiting or running U.S. military personnel and receiving secret information from them. Don't get the wrong idea, this isn't common, but it's not that unusual either. What was unusual was running an FBI agent. The FBI prides itself on being one of the primary guardians of the United States, whether it's investigating homegrown terrorist threats or foreign agents operating in the USA. Moreover, from its inception under J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI has promoted itself and its personnel as the living embodiment of truth, justice, and the American way, to quote a certain superhero. So when Robert Hanssen, a longtime FBI agent, was arrested in 2001 for having spied for the Soviet Union and its successor Russia, the Bureau and the nation were shocked, though Hanssen later stated that he was upset with the path the U.S. was taking and found elements of Soviet communism appealing. Most agreed that his primary motivation was money. Somehow, that makes what he did for over 20 years all the more upsetting. Hanssen joined the FBI in 1976 and worked in various departments, including counterintelligence. For years, there was a stupefying amount of overlap between the work of the FBI and that of the CIA. In 1981, talks between Congress, the FBI, and the CIA spelled out the roles of each agency. Generally speaking, the FBI would work on domestic affairs, and the CIA overseas, cooperating when necessary. This agreement came about due to the CIA operations in the USA that the FBI objected to, and a lot of operational overlap and wasted money. This was especially so regarding counterintelligence operations in the United States, investigating foreign spies operating on U.S. soil. For quite some time, Robert Hanssen, who prided himself on his intelligence and ability to fool what he had believed to be his rather dull superiors, was one of the chief counterintelligence agents in the FBI. This gave him access to all sorts of information, including information on what Soviet personnel and operations the Bureau was investigating, and how the Soviets and their Eastern European allies could avoid being caught. Sometimes working in concert with the CIA and other American intelligence agencies, like the National Security Agency, NSA, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, also gave Hansen access to information regarding American agents in the Soviet Union, as well as information on Soviet government and military officials recruited to spy for America. Many of those Soviet assets and American agents supplied not only information on Soviet military and political secrets, but also on the names and activities of Soviets spying in the US, which Hansen was supposed to be preventing. Well, it's believed that information supplied by Hansen to the Russians for those 20 years caused the capture, torture, and execution of at least a dozen Soviet citizens, providing crucial information to the United States. In many cases, the vital information that the US was receiving on the USSR and Russia dried up, all due to Hansen. And for a while, US intelligence was blind regarding developments inside Russia. And again, while Hansen disagreed with some aspects of American life and policy, his main goal was making money. And he was well paid, nearly $1.5 million. As time went by, Hansen, an incredibly intelligent man with a huge ego, was also motivated by outsmarting his compatriots, who he believed were being promoted over him despite his talent. In February 2001, Hansen was arrested when a Russian intelligence officer, Sergei Tretyakov, who had worked with the KGB and its successor, the SVR, defected to the United States and gave them, the CIA and FBI, Hansen's information. Tretyakov stated that he defected to the USA out of disgust with what Russia had become. He also received $2 million from the US government for the information he gave on Hansen and others. The man responsible for what officials in the Department of Justice called possibly the worst intelligence disaster in U.S. history was given a life sentence and is incarcerated at ADX Federal Prison in Colorado. All for money and pride. This has been History on Fleek. See you next time.